Well, hello everyone. This is Mr. Rachel. In this particular video, what we're going to be talking about is how we can draw some conclusions from a given set of facts using deductive reasoning. And so in this particular video, we're going to talk about how we can draw a conclusion using what's called the law of detachment. And so what the law of detachment is, you just watched a video, but just as a quick refresher, you assume that a conditional to start with is true if there is a logical statement that is logically identical to your hypothesis. Then you can conclude the conclusion of that conditional. And what that looks like is if you start out with a statement, if P then Q, and then you have an additional statement that is logically identical to the hypothesis, then you're able to make a conclusion. And remember, we used like a graphic organizer to help us really tell whether or not that's a logically identical statement. In fact, if we can actually draw a conclusion. And we'll do a couple of examples here where we can draw conclusions just to make sure that we're on the same page. So let's take a look at an example here. So I'm going to assume that both of these statements are true. Of course, the conditional is true, and we're going to assume that the second given statement is also true, but I'm going to go ahead and read it for you. The first thing is, if you're an angle greater than 90 and less than 180 degrees, then you are obtuse. And then the statement that goes along with that, angle 1 is 139 degrees. So let's take a look at that. So my given conditional is that whole first sentence. If you are an angle greater than 90 and less than 180 degrees, then you're obtuse. And then, of course, the second statement here is angle 1 is 139 degrees. Okay, so let's go ahead and label the important parts of that original conditional, and then let's think about that second statement about the angle 1 being 139 degrees to figure out what we need to figure out. So of course, I know my original hypothesis on the first conditional is that an angle is greater than 90 and less than 180 degrees. I know that my conclusion on that original conditional there was that you are an obtuse angle. And the question I'm asking myself right now is, how does this statement, angle 1 is 139 degrees, line up with my original hypothesis? And in fact, so that's what I'm asking myself. So I'm going to go ahead, before I do anything else, I'm going to take a look. I'm going to go ahead and make my diagram so I get a real good idea of where everything lines up. So I'm going to make my little, I don't know if you want to call it my Venn diagram, but I know my hypothesis. I'm going to write that in my inner circle. That's where I start. And the hypothesis is that the angle is greater than 90 but less than 180. And my conclusion, notice that goes in the bigger outer part of the circle. My conclusion is you're an obtuse angle. So I need to figure out, well, where does angle 1 equaling 139 degrees fall? And of course, 139 degrees is greater than 90 and less than 180. And so I call that hitting the bullseye. And the reason this is important, since my angle 1 is 139 degrees, that's basically logically identical to my hypothesis, P. That means that I can make a conclusion here. I can logically conclude, because my second statement there is logically identical to P, I can conclude that angle 1 is obtuse. And so remember, when you're using the law of detachments, you're looking at a set of facts and seeing if you can arrive at a logical conclusion based on these facts. Now, in this case, you were able to. Let's take a look at another example. Before we take a look at that next example, let's talk about why we can conclude angle 1 is 139 degrees. Well, we're starting with our law of detachment, right? Remember, if P then Q, we assume that's true. That was that first statement right there. If you were an angle greater than 90 and less than 180, then we're obtuse. And then our next statement here, P, angle 1 is 139 degrees. Well, the big important thing for you to remember is that was logically identical to the hypothesis that you started with on your original conditional. And since that's logically identical, we're able to conclude, since the hypothesis was logically identical to where I started, I'm able to conclude the conclusion of that sentence, which is angle 1 is obtuse. I'm going to go back and let you guys look at that for just a moment. Process that for a minute. And we're going to take a look at another example where you can draw a conclusion based on the facts that you started with. So, if you get the Red Ryder rifle, by the way, if you've ever seen A Christmas Story, that's where this conditional comes from. If you get the Red Ryder rifle, then you will shoot your eye out. In another given statement, Ralphie gets the rifle. Okay? Well, we're going to consider that both of these statements are true. We're going to consider them to be facts. And then we're going to see if we can reach a logical conclusion based on these facts. And so as we start, my original conditional was the part about if you get the Red Ryder rifle, then you will shoot your eye out. So let's go ahead and identify the important pieces of this particular conditional. And so my conditional is, you get the Red Ryder rifle. That's my hypothesis. The conclusion is, you will shoot your eye out. And then the question I have is, well, where does this statement, Ralphie getting the rifle, line up with my original hypothesis P? And so for me, it always helps for me to draw my little diagram here. My statement P is, I get the Red Ryder rifle. My statement Q is, you're going to shoot your eye out. And now I have to decide, well, Ralphie getting the Red Ryder rifle, does that go in the innermost bullseye, or does that not fit in the inner bullseye? And in this case, Ralphie getting the rifle is logically identical to the hypothesis. And since I'm hitting that bullseye, basically, or since I'm logically identical to the hypothesis, I can actually make a conclusion. But the only conclusion that I can make here is the conclusion of the original conditional, which was Ralphie shoots his eye out. So I can logically conclude from this set of facts, these two statements, that Ralphie shoots his eye out. Now, looking at it with a symbolic notation, let's go back and look at our law of detachment here. My original conditional was, if you get the Red Ryder rifle, then you will shoot your eye out. Now, the question is this statement about Ralphie getting the rifle logically identical to my original hypothesis? And in this case, yes, it's logically identical. And so since Ralphie getting the rifle is logically identical, I can then conclude the other part, which is Ralphie shooting his eye out. So these are just a couple of examples of how the law of detachment works. It is going to be tricky, and I understand that. While you first navigate your way through this, you just need to practice and just be very logical and really pay attention to the statements that you have or the set of facts that you have to see if you can draw a conclusion. So in this video, I gave you two examples of a set of facts where you could actually draw a conclusion deductively using the law of detachment.